Welcome to the workshop Building Ministries of Accompaniment. My name is Brian Rhude. I'm the project coordinator for the Catholic Apostolate Center. I serve on the National Advisory Team for Young Adult Ministry and also work for the School of Theology and Religious Studies at the Catholic University of America. Before we start the workshop, I'd like to thank the USCCB Committee on Laity, Marriage, Family Life, and Youth, the National Advisory Team, and the Forum Planning Team for inviting me to give this workshop. What we'll talk about during our time together is ministry with young adults in our parishes. We'll talk about ministry that's modeled after Emmaus. We'll ask, what is our ministry? Ministry to and with young adults. We'll talk about accompaniment and why it's important. We'll talk a little bit about the reality of the situation we find ourselves in, our COVID reality, and the reality of a lot of ministry to be focused on events and numbers. And then after that, I'll provide 3 tips, suggestions about how we can build ministries of accompaniment. How we welcome young adults as members of the entire parish community. How we build intergenerational relationships and radical availability. What is that and what are its implications? We'll start by talking about Emmaus as our model of ministry. And so we remember from this story, from the Gospel of Luke, that Jesus went to the disciples in the midst of their hurt and confusion. And in the midst of that hurt and confusion, he listened to them. He walked with them and listened to them and then remained with them. And it's that listening and the teaching that followed the listening that results in the disciples begging for him to stay with them when he's ready to leave. And so they sit down at table, Jesus breaks the bread, and it's in that moment that they recognize that it's been him all along. The Lord, the Messiah whom they had come to know. And as soon as they recognize him, he's gone, and they say, were our hearts not burning within us? And they return to proclaim what they'd experienced. And so here Jesus provides us with a model of ministry, one centered on the Eucharist and on accompaniment. And so we're forced to ask ourselves, is our ministry to and with young adults rooted in the Eucharist and spiritual accompaniment? We'll start by talking about ministry that is not just to young adults, but with them. And you've heard me say that a couple times. We hear about co-responsibility in the church. And that's not just about co-responsibility between the laity and the clergy as states of life. In Christus Vivit, Pope Francis calls young people to be protagonists. And that certainly requires that our young people be energetic and engaged, but it also means that our ministers need to give them opportunity to be protagonists. If we don't practice that co-responsibility between our lay ecclesial ministers and our volunteers and those we serve, we risk ministry that is person-centric, built up around the individual minister, and that can easily collapse when someone has to move on. When we minister with young adults, we allow for our encounter with Christ to be fueled by the Eucharist and strengthened by our accompaniment. It allows us to lead, like the disciples on the road to Emmaus, those whom we accompany to return and to proclaim God's goodness with hearts ablaze. So accompaniment. Why is it important? I've talked a tiny bit about this already, but let's talk about it a little more. Pope Francis really began to put a great emphasis on accompaniment when his pontificate started in 2013. He's asked us to remove our sandals in front of the holy ground of the individuals whom we encounter and accompany, like Moses with the burning bush. In Amoris Laetitia, he likened the church to a field hospital, this beautiful image. He's spoken of the need of accompaniment of young adults by adults, and I would extend also by one another. I would invite you to think back to your first encounter with Jesus and with those subsequent ones that have come since. In Deus Caritas Est, Pope Benedict XVI says, being Christian is not the result of an ethical choice or a lofty idea, but the encounter with an event, a person, which gives life a new horizon and a decisive direction. We encounter that person Jesus Christ, in the sacraments, especially in the Eucharist, but we also encounter him in our interactions with one another, in our relationships of faith in which we talk with one another and walk with one another. We've all had mentors, spiritual friendships, mother or father figures who've walked with us on this journey of faith, whom we can thank as a part of the reason that we serve the church that we have grown to love. And the life of the church, the history of the church, is full of stories of accompaniment that bred great saints. Saints Francis and Clare, Saints Francis Xavier and Ignatius Loyola, Saints Vincent Pallotti and Gaspar del Bufalo. You can go on and on and on. And so our accompaniment must be done without judgment. We must always be ready to listen and willing to enter into the messiness of another person's life. And we'll talk more about that when I talk about radical availability. It was accompaniment for me as a late youth and early young adult, which led me into entering fully into the church and now working for the church in ministry. So I've talked about why accompaniment is important. And before we get into how we can build ministries of accompaniment, I'd like to take a second to discuss where we're at right now. The first is the popular model of ministry in our parishes and institutions. Numbers, 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 events, events, events. I won't dwell on this for too long because I know my colleague and friend Sean Allen is giving a presentation on moving from event-based to person-based ministry. But we know that this model only works to a certain extent. The way I think about it, events and accompaniment form a circle, if you will. Events allow us to make connections. They help us to form initial relationships, to kind of plant those seeds, to find community. The accompaniment which follows strengthens those connections, strengthens those relationships. And then further events regather the larger community, help us to deepen those connections with the larger group. And then accompaniment follows. Event ministry without accompaniment is a weak model. And so we have to think, when it comes to our events, how does this event lead me and those I serve closer to Christ? How does it fit into the development of Christocentric relationships, relations centered around Jesus? The way I think of it, Jesus didn't just feed the 5,000, but also helped the leper and the lame and the impaired individually, one by one. So too then must we serve both the crowds and the individuals. The second is our COVID reality. COVID has forced us away from our events because we simply can't hold them right now. Now, certainly in the summer, as things began to slow down, we began to see socially distanced events. But for the most part, we've been relegated to being online. Many working young adults, like myself, are just tired of Zoom and Google Meets, so events simply made virtual aren't necessarily great alternatives. COVID, in all of its difficulties and trials, has forced us to accompany through text, call, email, socially distant coffee outside, and yes, even the dreaded virtual meeting when appropriate. But it's forced us to realize that we can't use numbers as our gauge of effectiveness in ministry in the same way that we have before. What people, not just young people, need is someone to walk with them through their furlough, through their layoff, their sickness or the sickness of a loved one, their isolation, the fear. And this is where we're called to accompany. So with all of that being said, how do we build ministries of accompaniment? And I already said my 3 suggestions. Young adults as members of the entire community. The building of intergenerational relationships. And radical availability and its implications. It's our tendency to make groups, right, within our communities. Youth group, women's group, men's group, this group, that group. And oftentimes these groups will flourish. But what can that do? It can create communities within communities. We have a strong women's group. We have a strong youth group. We have a strong men's group. How often do they interact? How often do they pray together? How often do they learn to pray the way that the other prays? Young adults are not just a group in the church. They are the church, just as much as you are, just as much as their older brothers and sisters are. And no, not the church of tomorrow. Young people have heard that for too long, youth and young adults alike, but the church of now. Young adults should not only be able to be active participants in the church, but should be encouraged to be by being lectors, extraordinary ministers of Holy Communion, ushers, religious educators. The list can go on and on. And if representative of the parish community in places of leadership, so as to best represent themselves and other young adults. Intergenerational relationships. Young adults are in an interesting, but really a blessed place with their age. They're older than youth group kids, sometimes by quite a bit, but they're also younger than a large group of our older parishioners, again, sometimes by quite a bit. Pope Francis talks about intergenerational relationships in Christus Vivi, and their importance really can't be overstated. And so how can these relationships be cultivated? And certainly it requires creativity for us to think about ways we can bring the old and the young together. Pope Francis talks about making sure that young people are rooted, right? Old people have all this experience. Older people have experience that they can bring. Young people have dreams. And how do we marry those dreams and those experiences? Can young adults be paired up with older members of the parish to support one another, to learn from one another? What does it mean to just simply introduce them and allow a regular phone call? A way to connect, a way to learn, a way to grow. Can young adults and younger members of the parish safely interact and learn from one another? In both of these situations, youth and experience both educate us as we dream for the future and reminisce in our youth. And we too should be taking part in these relationships. We accompany, but we should also be accompanied, so to grow in our own lives of faith. Lastly, radical availability and intentionality. And this one really is on us as young adult ministers. A priest friend of mine told me of his principle of radical availability, and I've loved it ever since. He talks about the students at the university that he was chaplain of, that they were always encouraged to reach out to him via text or call at any moment of the night or day for pastoral care and especially for confession. He loves the sacrament of reconciliation. And so I'm not saying that you need to do that for various reasons, right? We know as ministers it's important to have boundaries. It's important that we take care of ourselves when we rest. But it does tell us something. To be in young adult ministry with young adults requires a bit of abnormality, right? It's early morning coffees. It's post 5 p.m. Drinks or dinner. This ministry isn't your average 9 to 5. I work on a college campus right now, doing formation work with our students. And believe me, there are plenty of days that I wish I could just go home at 5 p.m. But if I did that, I'd never get to interact with my students. They have class during the day. Some of them have class at night too. But that's why if we strictly work a 9 to 5, we wouldn't reach those we're called to reach. Sometimes we have to work before it. Sometimes we have to work after it. Most days we have to work all three. This availability requires us to be intentional. It's so easy to get tired with our wild hours, with active events, office work, and whatever else we have going on in our own lives. But we can't let that get in the way of being the face of Christ to our young adults. If I'm going to commit to an 8 a.m. coffee with someone, I have to be there. Not just physically, emotionally, spiritually, with the individual, taking my shoes off out of reverence to their holy ground, to let them know that their story matters, their time matters, and that they matter. And that takes a lot of openness to God's grace. We cannot do it alone. If we're going to be available, then we need to be intentional with and during our availability. That requires humility. That requires honesty with ourselves to say, you know what? I had a really late night event. I can't do coffee the next morning because I can't be available to someone who I need to serve. And have the humility to say that. And so what does this availability require? It requires pastoral listening. It requires vulnerability and being a fearless healer. And so some of these might be familiar, others might not. We'll talk about them briefly. Pastoral listening, such an important skill. We don't just listen to respond, right? So many times in conversation, we want to listen. We're kind of fidgeting, kind of grinding our teeth because we're waiting for that person to stop so we can respond. But pastoral listening isn't that. We have to listen to those we accompany, like Jesus on the road to Emmaus, to listen to enter into that individual's life, into their situation, into their moment in time that they are bringing. And so to pastorally listen, we have to ask questions that go deeper into their reality. Not only for our own context, so we can understand what's going on better, but also to help them dig deeper, right? So that we can help them come to the answers that the Spirit is leading them to, right? That accompaniment isn't us just giving them answers, but helping them to come to them themselves. We have to be vulnerable. We have to be vulnerable to those whom we accompany. We need to be vulnerable to show that we're invested in the relationship. Vulnerable in our humility and in our ability to be real with the people we accompany. And vulnerability yields trust, which is essential to relationships of accompaniment. We have to be vulnerable, to be open, to be honest, to show that we are committed. And lastly, being a fearless healer. I would caution us from believing that being a fearless healer means that we see ourselves as the answer to all of a person's problems. That we are the one that can fix them, that can make them whole, that can bring them to completion, when the reality is that only Jesus can do that. Sometimes our healing is our referral in knowing that I can't handle the situation, but a counselor, a therapist, a priest, someone who's a specialist, they can. Being a fearless healer also means that we're fearless in how we enter into the lives of the ones whom we accompany. Fearless in our willingness to meet them where they're at, in their confusion, their messiness, and yes, to meet them in their sin. We do so because Jesus did the same, and he's done that for us. We meet them in their sin as they meet us in ours, so that we can walk on the road to Christ together, so we can grow in holiness together. Friends, our ministry must be that of accompaniment. Young people, all people, but especially young people, seek relationship. Not someone to tell them what to do, to grab them by the arm and pull them, but to take their hand and to walk with them and to listen. Young people seek community. And let this community be one of accompaniment. Let us build intergenerational relationships, be radically available and intentional, and help our young adults not just to be a part of the community, a group of the community, but to be in the community as a whole, as members of the body, as St. Paul would say. My friends, I thank you for taking the time to listen. I hope that this is thought-provoking. I hope that it's challenging. Know that I'm praying for you and your ministry, that it's fruitful and builds up great saints for our church through Accompaniment, that we can continue to walk on this journey to heaven together. And I hope that you'll pray for me and my ministry, and may God bless you.